part of the book, The Cast of Characters. And in this section, I tell the story of the main players in this story, in particular, Charles Rowland. After that section, I take the reader on a journey through the theater's first 100 years, and then I conclude the book with a scrapbook of photos from throughout the years. I'll share some highlights from the book today, and I'll start with this man, Charles Heading Rowland. I was very fortunate in my research in that one of our board members is married to the great-great-grandson of Rowland, and so I had access to the family archives. The theater happened near the end of Charles's life, and the story of how he became the man he was is the stuff that movies are made of. The story of Charles Rowland is the story of coal mines and railroads and politics. The story even includes murder, although I will assure you that Charles is the good guy. I had several incidents of serendipity with this book, and this photo is one of them. This is the earliest known photo of Houtzdale, a small community in Clearfield County. It just so happens that 1874 is the year that Charles Rowland moved to Houtzdale from Huntington County with his family. He was 13 years old. Houtzdale was incorporated in 1872, and in 1874, it was a town that was still under construction. I just love that we can see the town as it looked when the Rowland family moved there. Charles would spend 26 years in Houtzdale. The US Census and courthouse deeds helped me place the whereabouts of the Rowlands in their early years in Houtzdale. The 1880 census stated that 19-year-old Charles Rowland was a store clerk in Houtzdale at that time. In the mid to late 1800s, Houtzdale was sitting atop the celebrated Meshannon coal vein, and by 1888, Rowland was operating the coal mines of Philadelphia businessman Samuel Langdon. This article about coal land developments in Houtzdale was in the June 13th, 1892 edition of the Altoona Tribune and mentions the Houtzdale coal mines of Langdon. Samuel Langdon is one of the most intriguing characters of this book. In the late 1800s, the Pennsylvania Railroad ruled the landscape when it came to transportation. Samuel Langdon was tired of the concessions that had to be made to the PRR to get his coal to market, and so he decided to build his own railroad. In 1892, he incorporated the Altoona and Phillipsburg Connecting Railroad. Charles Rowland was one of the 10 bondholders of this railroad. Many people believed Langdon was bluffing when he proposed a railroad to rival the PRR. He definitely wasn't bluffing. The Altoona and Phillipsburg Connecting Railroad made its first run in 1894. This little railroad had many, many reorganizations in its short life and many different names, and it was easier to just refer to it by its nickname, the Alley Popper. Railroad buffs from across the country know this railroad very well. A former editor at the Progress newspaper, George Scott, said in a newspaper column that the Alley Popper line never even got halfway to Altoona and never grew more than 12.5 miles. But in the 1890s, it provided a valuable service of transportation to passengers throughout the Houtzdale and Phillipsburg area, and it connected Langdon's mines with the Beech Creek Railroad. For Charles Rowland, the Alley Popper would remain one of the most important parts of his life. By the end of his life, he was the owner of the railroad. The business enterprises of Samuel Langdon steered the early direction of Charles Rowland's life, but luckily, Rowland didn't follow in the path of Langdon's personal life. In 1896, Rowland was summoned by telegram to an emergency meeting in Philadelphia to discuss the future of the railroad company. Its president, Samuel Langdon, had been charged with murder. Different newspapers ran different courtroom sketches, and he looks different in all of them. Langdon was charged with the murder of 18-year-old Annie McGrath. This case made headlines in newspapers across the country. Langdon was very wealthy, and it was quite a sordid case. Newspapers were great back then. They described everything. I won't go into all of the details on this case, but to put it briefly, Langdon, who was 45, and McGrath, who was 18, were purporting themselves to be husband and wife. A servant girl found Annie dead with a pillow over her face in their bedroom in an apartment he rented in Philadelphia. When Langdon left the apartment, he told the servant that Annie wasn't feeling well. Newspapers at the time said she inhaled a powerful drug. After Langdon was arrested, police found a little pocket notebook on him that said, quote, capital A period died at 10 p.m., end of quote. Langdon is shown here in a sketch from the Philadelphia Inquirer at the coroner's inquest. 16 days after being charged with murder, Langdon was released from jail and charges dropped because officials said the Commonwealth could not prove cause of death. The Altoona Mirror on April 10, 1896 stated, quote, the failure of authorities after the autopsy and chemical analysis to discover a scintilla of clue as to the agency of death stamps the case as one of the profoundest mysteries in police annals, end of quote. I think his money definitely played a role in the outcome of this murder case. Rowland's telegram summoning him to Philadelphia coincides with the Philadelphia newspaper articles stating that a group from the railroad met with Langdon in prison. Legal troubles would follow Langdon for the rest of his life. Samuel Langdon had been instrumental in Charles Rowland's rise to wealth, but as the century was ending, Rowland was ready to break that tie. Before I move on from the alley popper, I want to mention one highlight in the railroad's life. In 1914, Rowland was living in Phillipsburg and was president of the railroad. It had a couple engines that had outlived their usefulness, and Lubin Film Company of Philadelphia was contacted about filming a staged train wreck. On September 8th, 1914, thousands of people traveled to Phillipsburg to watch this staged train crash. This has been cited as the first deliberately staged train wreck for a movie. 2 days after the train crash, the filmmakers returned to the site to film footage with actors. The original movie using this footage was The Valley of Lost Hope, directed by Romaine Fielding. Fielding used the train crash footage in 5 other silent films. The only surviving footage of that crash comes from one of those other short films shown here, A Partner to Providence, and this is a short clip from that. I'll read you an excerpt from the book which quotes the Altoona Tribune. Quote, with whistles shrieking, throttles wide open, and steam hissing from noisy cylinders, 2 locomotives hauling trains on the Pittsburgh and Susquehanna Railroad rushed toward a point where they met in a terrific head-on collision before the eyes of thousands of spectators at 5 o'clock yesterday afternoon, 1 mile east of Phillipsburg. A minute previous to the collision, the engine men leaped from the cabs to safety, end of quote. The last part of the clip was filmed with the actors, obviously. The Rowland Theater did not exist in 1914, but soon after it opened, it showed the Valley of Lost Hope. The year of that train crash, 1914, was also the year that Charles tossed his hat into the political ring to run for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives for the 21st District. He had moved from Houtzdale to Tyrone in 1900 and then to Phillipsburg in 1903. Rowland would go on to win the election as well as a re-election in 1916. If you've driven through Phillipsburg, you might remember seeing this house. Charles and his wife and 5 children moved into what became known as the Roland Mansion. It is still one of the most beautiful homes in town. As soon as Charles moved to Phillipsburg, he became involved in projects to better the community. He was part of a group of men that brought the Phillipsburg trolley to life, and he served as its honorary conductor on its first run through town on Christmas Eve, 1903. After moving to Phillipsburg, Rowland and his family would spend the summer season at Hecla Park near Bellefonte, shown here. They would summer with his Tyrone friends and their families there. Roland's closest friends were the ones he made in his 3 years living in Tyrone. Those men were the movers and shakers and top names of Tyrone at that time. In 1910, Rowland and one of his Tyrone friends, R.B. Freeman, were on the board of governors at Nittany Country Club at the park. In that year, the new country club home was built at the park at a cost of $8,700 and was described in the Tyrone Daily Herald as, quote, one of the prettiest and most prosperous clubs in central Pennsylvania, end of quote. Rowland was still a coal man and railroad man while living in Phillipsburg, but I've spent enough time on that. I'll steer us back to the theater. The subtitle of my book is Beauty from Ashes, and the following slides will show why. On December 30th, 1910, at about 5 a.m., fire broke out in downtown Phillipsburg. One of the buildings destroyed in that large blaze was the Pierce Opera House, shown here being sprayed with water. The Pierce Opera House was on the site that became the Rowland Theater. This is the site after the fire. You can see the Pierce Opera House structure in the center where the White Arch is. The fire debris of the Pierce Opera House remained at the site for 5 years. Sometime during 1915, a young Phillipsburg man approached Charles Rowland with the idea of building a high-class theater in the town. Charles Rowland liked the idea, and he purchased the property at the end of 1915. In the spring of 1916, work began on cleaning up the ashes, and construction started soon after that. As construction was continuing on the theater in the spring of 1917, Charles Rowland had a lot of other business occupying his mind. He was sitting in this room, shown here, on April 2nd, 1917, for President Woodrow Wilson's famous war address, asking Congress to enter the country into the conflict that became known as World War I. A few days later, Rowland cast his vote in favor of entering the country into the war. A few months after that vote, the Rowland Theater was ready for business. It opened for the first time on June 4th and 5th with the silent film Within the Law. This is a newspaper ad for the opening of the new Rowland Theater. Unfortunately, this is considered a lost film by the Library of Congress. The theater had to share newspaper space on the day of its opening with some other pretty big events happening in the world. This box ran on page 1 of the Progress newspaper of Clearfield on June 4th, 1917, the day of the theater's opening. It announced 1 day until registration day, the military draft. This makes me wonder about the emotions that had to be going through people's minds that warm summer night as they attended the opening night movie. This photo is one of the few photos we have from the opening summer of 1917. The second floor of the theater housed offices, and the third floor was a ballroom. The theater also housed 2 storefronts on each side of the entrance. Today, the second and third floor have been empty and without power or utilities for about 50 years, but we do still have store tenants in each of our storefronts. Before I move on from this shot, take a look at the lower right-hand storefront. There's a man and a small child in that doorway. When I zoom in, it's a little grainy, but you can see the man a little better. The photo at left is of Albert J. Fleckenstein, the theater's first manager. He's the young man who talked to Charles Rowland in 1915 about building a high-class movie theater in town. In looking at the photo of the theater from 1917, I would bet the farm that that man in that doorway is A.J. Fleckenstein. The nose and receding hairline have pretty much cinched my conclusion here. This photo was taken on the same day as that outside shot of the theater. This is the view from the stage. The view is pretty much the same today. When you come into the Rowland Theater, it really is like stepping back into time. Here's another photo taken in the summer of 1917. The theater was built for not only silent movies, but also for stage shows, and this was a set for one of those shows. This photo also captures the beautiful mural that surrounded the stage when it was built. This photo shows a section of the mural. The mural included elements of comedy and tragedy. Unfortunately, a leaking roof in the 70s destroyed most of the mural. In the early 90s, the theater board brought in Albert Michael's gallery to try to see if any of the mural was salvageable, and this portion was the only part that was. This is a view of the stage today. The mural is gone except for that little piece above the stage doorway at right. And I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it's that piece that I showed you in the previous slide. This is another photo of the lobby from that 1917 summer day. And here's our beautiful lobby 100 years later at Christmas time. The light fixtures, the marble, and all of the structure is still original. A few years after the opening, someone was taking photos around Phillipsburg. On this day in 1925, there were 3 photos taken under the marquee, and this is one of those. We don't know who this woman is. Our guess is that she is with one of the neighboring storefronts. This is another photo from that day, and again, we don't know who these people are. This is the last of those photos. If it looks familiar, it's the cover shot on the book, and again, I don't know who these people are. I picked this one for the cover of the book because I just really liked it. Even today, this is the angle where I take most of my photos outside the theater. I mentioned that the theater came near the end of Charles Rowland's life. Rowland died on Thanksgiving Day, November 21st, 1921, a month shy of his 61st birthday. The headline says he was 62, but he was 60. The theater darkened its lights throughout the weekend in honor of its owner. Charles had been one of Phillipsburg's biggest benefactors, and his name is on practically every charter of every organization formed during his time in Phillipsburg. The theater remained in the hands of the Rowland family for the next 60 years. Rowland's son Howard briefly helped out as manager in the early 30s, but other than that, the family was not involved in its operation. Life was a roller coaster for the Rowland Theater during its first century, and I won't go into all of it today, but I do want to share some highlights and photos of the theater through the years. We'll jump forward to the theater's first big milestone, its 50th anniversary in 1967. This is a great photo taken outside the theater for that celebration. If you look, the girl in the front row, third from left, is Kathy Graffias. She was the daughter of longtime manager Harold Graffias. Harold began his career at the theater in 1927 at the age of 16 as a projectionist, and he eventually became manager and stayed with the theater until 1973. I had heard that Harold had a daughter living in Florida, and so I Googled Kathy Graffias, Florida, and I called. The first phone number came up, and amazingly enough, she answered, and it was her. She hasn't been back to Phillipsburg since she left in the 70s. She's very old school, doesn't use a computer, and she mailed me all of her original photos from the 50th celebration, as well as other photos, and she told me stories about her father. These really helped me to understand and appreciate his life with the theater. And I do want to add that we immediately made copies and sent the originals back, and they arrived safely. There's one other person I'll point out in this photo. The first manager, Albert Fleckenstein, is in the front row, third from right. A big night in the theater's history happened a few years later. The Pennsylvania premiere of the movie, The Cross and the Switchblade, was held at the Rowland Theater in October 1970. The movie was based on a book written by a former Phillipsburg minister, David Wilkerson, who had moved to New York City and did ministry with gangs. This photo shows the Phillipsburg Osceola Band playing outside the theater for that evening under the marquee that was on the building at the time. One of the main actors in the film came to Phillipsburg to attend the premiere, and I don't know if anybody recognizes who that is. His name is Eric Estrada. He had his first big feature film role in this movie. He's shown here with his escort for the evening, Miss Teenage Phillipsburg Susan Gates. And two interesting things to mention here. Eric Estrada would go on to star in the TV show Chips a few years later, and Susan would go on after this evening to win the Pennsylvania teen pageant. So this was 1970. The 70s were not only a turbulent decade in the country, but they were the theater's hardest years. Kathy Graffias, the daughter of longtime manager Harold Graffias, just kept telling me on the phone that, quote, the theater killed Daddy. The theater was the family's livelihood, and people had stopped coming to the movies, and it was very difficult for the family. Harold left the theater in 1973, and the family moved first to California, where Harold died a few years later. Kathy then moved to Florida. We'll fast forward 8 years from the time this photo was taken. This photo was taken in 1978 by the orchestra pit in front of the stage. A leaking roof and years of disrepair led to the closing of the theater's doors in October of this year. The Roland heirs were still owners, but they weren't involved with its operations, and they leased it to different people. The Roland family didn't want to sink money into repairing the theater, and they put it up for sale. Our story could have ended right there. A group of residents in Phillipsburg didn't want that to happen. With the help of this group, a buyer was found for the theater. He was Robert Sheriff from Chester Hill. Sheriff had the auditorium gutted and repainted. This shot is taken from the stage looking toward the balcony. He reopened the theater with a grand gala talent show in October 1981. The theater was sold out that night for the talent show, proving that Phillipsburg was thrilled to have the theater back open. This wasn't the point of the theater living happily ever after, though. The theater would close again 9 months later when Robert Sheriff ran into some financial difficulties. By May of 1982, the theater went up for a sheriff sale. This newspaper ad from 1982 states that the theater was for sale. It states that this property can be modified for other commercial uses and will make an excellent business investment for a small purchase price. Once again, the story could have ended right there, but members of the community again formed to try to save the theater. Their efforts paid off. I'm really condensing the story of the theater in the 70s and 80s for this presentation. To sum it up, the community would not let the theater die. It came very close to having its story end a few times. Eventually, Phillipsburg Borough jumped in and took over ownership of the building. The borough had no intention of operating a theater, and it leased the theater to the nonprofit Rowland Theater Incorporated in 1991, and that is where we stand today. In the years since, we've had several special guests, including former President Jimmy Carter in 2002, and Tony Orlando on that same evening. We try to keep true to our original roots and hold live shows in addition to our movies. One of our very favorite offerings has been hosting Paragon Ragtime Orchestra. They usually come to us every spring. We're very fortunate to be a favorite venue for Paragon. This orchestra, under the direction of Rick Benjamin, sets up in our orchestra pit and plays the original scores and all of the sound effects to silent films shown on the big screen. And this is a photo from one of their shows at the theater. Our theater was built for this show. This is another wonderful photo from one of the shows. Unfortunately, we had to cancel our spring shows this year due to COVID. They've promised they'll be back next year, and I hope that Mary and the Historical Society will help us share with all of you the date of the show, because it really is an amazing evening. And we have plenty of seats if you want to come. I've shared just a few highlights and photos from the Rowland story, and if anyone is interested in purchasing copies of the book, the Historical Society does have them. 100% of the proceeds from the book go towards the theater. We're run by volunteers, including our manager, so everything we raise is put into this beautiful treasure. I want to conclude the presentation to address the state of the theater right now. We were closed for 80 days from March 17th through June 4th due to COVID-19. In comparison, the theater was closed for 5 weeks during the Spanish influenza in 1918. During our closure, we did a couple things. Before COVID hit, we had begun planning for a seating project to replace our seats, starting with the lower balcony. We had put a deposit on new seats for the lower balcony and had them on order prior to COVID, and as it turned out, the new leather seating will enable us to clean and sanitize them much better than the current fabric seats. During our closure, we removed the old seats in the lower balcony and gave them away for whatever donation anyone wanted to give us. And because we have a manager who can do anything, we have been doing all of the work ourselves to get ready for the new seats. And while we were working inside the theater, on the outside, we wanted to stay in the public's mind, and so we began putting things on our outside digital sign. We would put movie quotes and clips on the sign just for fun. We were often a stop for a photo opportunity. And we began to chronicle how many days our closure had been. We began hearing from people who were using our sign as a way to keep track of time and who enjoyed our daily postings. The governor gave the okay for the theater to reopen on June 5th. We didn't quite grasp the significance of that reopening date at the time, but it does coincide with the 1917 opening movie dates of the Rowland Theater, which was within the law on June 4th and 5th, 1917, which I thought was kind of a cool coincidence. We reopened on June 5th, 2020 with the 1985 movie Back to the Future and created this image to publicize our reopening. We're very happy to be back, but like every other nonprofit, we're struggling. We are only open 2 days a week right now, when in a pre-COVID world, we were open 7 days a week. But people are still not coming to the movies and attendance has been limited. If things don't change, we're on a trajectory to be out of money in all of our funds by the end of January. Expenses are far exceeding revenue at this point, but I'm not going to conclude this presentation on that note. We certainly hope for a return to some sense of normalcy in 2021. Our seat replacement project is continuing in the lower balcony. The new leather seats will be easy to clean and should help mitigate the spread of COVID-19 or any other future virus that may strike. We had raised some funds specifically earmarked for seats, and those funds have to be spent on the seats. And now I want to end this presentation with some fascinating finds in regard to that seating project. As I've said, we removed the seats from the lower balcony during our closure, and we knew we had a lot of floor repairs to do. 103 years left a lot of holes in the concrete floor. So don't worry as you look at this photo, they're not dead. This is board president Drew McDowell and our manager Kevin Conklin looking down a few of the holes in the empty lower balcony floor. They would put the hose from a shop vac down a hole and shine a light down another nearby hole, and they sucked up some amazing finds. We've got a perfectly preserved beech nut gum wrapper, my favorite, Clark's Tea Berry Chewing Gum, a 15-cent packet beech nut chewing tobacco. This was a fun find. They sucked up 2 lipstick tubes in the shop vac hose, and they were in very good shape with the lipstick intact. Luckily, after I posted this photo on Facebook, someone added some history about the lipstick tubes onto the post. The left taller tube is brass and engraved with the words Cara Gnome. This was a high-end drugstore makeup brand starting in the 20s, and this tube probably dates from the mid to late 30s. The smaller tube on the right is likely from the late teens to early 20s. This is our favorite find. This was our manager Kevin's first find. It's a wallet from 1942. There was no money inside, but there was an ID card, some chances from a festival, and some photos. The person who owned the wallet was a man named Edward Alberta from Morrisdale, who graduated from high school in 1942. We tried to find him, but he was drafted into the war the following year, and his family moved to New Jersey that same year in 1943. He married. We did find his obituary. They had no children. We're kind of at a dead end right now as to returning the wallet to its rightful owner. And there was something else in the wallet, which I'm going to show you on the next slide. Edward bought several chances to win a pony at the Chester Hill Labor Day Bazaar, held September 7th to 12th, 1942. And if you can see the ticket, you'll see that the main prize is an Indian Pinto pony with saddle and bridle. It says in the small print above it, saves tires, saves gas. We did track down the winner of the pony through old newspaper articles, and unfortunately, it wasn't Edward. The Rowland Theater is a true gem with a story that has everything. It has defied the odds to still be surviving in 2020. Up until earlier this year, I would have said surviving and thriving. I don't truly believe COVID can do us in. We've been through too much to let a pandemic take us down. But our future and our story does depend on people attending our movies and our shows. So when life does get back to normal, we would love to see you there. I'm usually there. Kevin, our manager, is too. If you're visiting from across the mountain, we would love to show you around. And in the meantime, if you'd like to visit the theater through the written page, you can get a copy of the book. So that's the end of my presentation. Thanks for having me today.
Oh, Rebecca, that was wonderful. Thank you so much if you'd like to turn on your audio, everyone, you're welcome to do so. Okay. Tom Berner says he recommends the silent movies.
Oh, great.
So yeah, no, this is just wonderful. And this is just such a wonderful story about really community and preservation, Rebecca. And I know that you and Kevin and so many others have had such a major involvement with its success. And if there's anything we can do, like you mentioned, to help promote and get the word out, please do let us know. We can do that.
Yeah, I mean, we'll let you know when we can start scheduling things again. And we definitely have to get Paragon back because they were made for our theater, and it's a great show. Just a preview, another show we had to cancel was Tom Sage, who is a Neil Diamond tribute artist. And he should be coming back to us in the spring. And he sang Neil Diamond at halftime at Beaver Stadium a couple of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So I think people in Center County would enjoy that.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. Does anyone have any questions or comments?
I have a question, if I may.
Yes, Roger.
Rebecca, you may have mentioned this, or I may have missed it. Is the Rowland on the National Register of Historic Places? And if so, when was it placed on?
Oh yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I did not mention that. So it was placed on the National Register in 1979. This was the year after the theater closed its doors. And the reason, I talked to a person from the group of that community that was forming to try to save the theater, and he said they just felt like getting it on the National Register would prevent whoever bought it from tearing it down. The theater was in such bad condition that they were afraid that somebody would buy it and then raise it. And so they felt like we've got to get it on the National Register to try to save it from being torn down. And so, yeah, it was 1979.
Rebecca, I'm looking forward to reading your book. I would imagine theater goers in Phillipsburg and the Center County's coal region would have had some up times in the 20s and down times in the 30s and tough times in the 40s. How do you characterize all that in the book?
And that, it is a good question. How, I don't know if I characterized it like perfectly. In Phillipsburg at the time, there was a theater down the street called the Majestic, and then there was the Rowland just right up a block from it. And the stories that people tell me are that the Rowland was the high class theater, and the Majestic was the one that showed like, it would have a column, you could sit behind a column and would not able to see the screen, and it showed like the cowboy movies, or you know, I think it was for your regular family folks to go to. I think I think using the roller coaster is a good definition of the theater's arc through the years. It started out great, like the newspaper articles were constantly saying about it being sold out. I mean, there's 1,000 seats in there. Just having that on a regular basis astounds me. And it's funny, Kevin, our manager, he's been involved with the theaters forever. He was running the lights at that 1981 talent. He was a kid of 18 at the time, but he was running lights for that 1981 Bob Sheriff talent show. And so he's devoted so much of his life to the theater. But he said on weekends, even just a couple decades ago, you would have hundreds of people every weekend at a movie. And even today, if we get a couple hundred, that's one of the big blockbusters of the year. Like, you know, for us to get a couple hundred people for a movie, it's one of Disney's biggest blockbusters, or Marvel big blockbusters. So it did have its rocky patches, but in the early part of its years, I think people did attend.
We appreciate having you be so passionate and keep up with this. Bravo.
Thank you.
Rebecca,
Yeah.
one other question. Has the Roland this year qualified for any grants?
So we did not apply for any of the early COVID funding. And it was one of those things where in the early days, you didn't dream that this would go on till summer. And it was one of those where, well, we don't really have a payroll because our manager's a volunteer. I mean, works full time at Penn State, but he devotes just as many hours to the theater, but he won't take a salary. And so without us having a payroll, we didn't go after any of the early COVID funds. And then as this wore on and we started looking, we did apply for a DCED Cultural and Museum Preservation Grant. We got turned down because we don't have a full-time person. That was one of their requirements. We do have an application in with the Center Foundation. I think that it's a smaller type grant, but we have an application in for that. We should be hearing soon. And then the Center County Block Grants, that deadline is tomorrow. And really, I just have to hit submit on that grant application. So I have to be optimistic that I think I hope we'll get some help. You know, that it has to end. I mean, I think it may take till next year. You know, I just hope people aren't used to streaming movies at home and that they become a little less afraid to attend a public theater. The one good thing about the theater, like you've seen the pictures, it's so spacious in there. This summer, I know the governor had the mandate of 25 people. Okay, that really wasn't a problem in our theater because we really never got more than 25 people on most of the movies. And you could you could have a whole section to yourself. I mean, there's so much space in there that I think on the one good side of, if you're looking at a safe place to go during COVID, I think we were as pretty safe as you could get.
Rebecca, you have over 1,000 seats in there, don't you?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah, there's the main floor has the most, has like 600 seats, say. Then there's a lower balcony, and then there's the upper balcony which has a couple hundred seats, still has the original 1917 seats, and we're not going to replace those. They're still usable, and if we have an event where we need the extra overflow, we can open that section. Haven't really had much opportunity to do that though, but hopefully we'll have that problem in the future.
Yeah. Wonderful. Good. Does anyone else have anything to ask Rebecca? Well, Rebecca, again, thank you so much for doing this. And we really appreciate your time and all of your effort with your presentation and also your book and everything you do with the Rowland Theater. Thank you.
Oh,
I think
Thank
we
you.
got to
It's really
all
nice to get
unmute
to share
and
the story. Thank you, Mary.
yes, thank you so much. This is just
Thanks.
wonderful. Good
Thanks.
thing. All right. Well, thank you everyone for attending today, we hope to see you at Tom Berner's presentation coming up on October 18th at 2 o'clock. Thank you.
Okay.
We'll sign off here.
All right. Thanks. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thanks. Leave.